share this link with others that may be interested. Please use the chat for questions, and I will ask Jimmy at the end of the presentation any questions. And if you have any technical issues, please message CareSpec for technical assistance. So the South Carolina Forestry Commission Urban and Community Forestry Program works primarily with municipalities and counties to build capacity in their urban and community forestry programs. Today's webinar is brought to you today by a grant from the U.S. Forest Service, and our partner Plan Green works with us to help have these webinars for you. Today we're going to have 1 hour of ISA certified arborist credit and 1 hour of SAF continuing forestry education credit, and that's if you're watching it live. So please email me if you have any questions about fwade@scfc.gov. We'll make sure to put that in the chat. And I should have your certification numbers and email from you when you register for class. And today I wanted to introduce to you Jimmy Walters, our speaker. He consults and performs contract work in arboriculture and urban forestry. He works with communities to develop and conduct on-site hands-on training in any aspect of tree care, from nursery production to removal, including tree selection, planting, pruning, protection. And he also provides consultation for specification review, ordinance development and review, and tree assessment. Additionally, Jimmy works for ISA Southern Chapter as a certified instructor for the Tree Risk Assessment Qualification course, and travels throughout the Southeast facilitating the course and administering the exam for this credential. And today, Jimmy Walters is going to discuss fruit and heart rots of pine trees. And welcome, Jimmy. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Francis. Let me clear up any misconceptions you might have gotten from that introduction. I'm not an expert. Okay, I'm a dirt forester who has a lot of experience and retired from the Forestry Commission roughly 10 years ago or so. But I'm going to share with you some things I've learned about these things, especially the root and butt rot, that kind of thing, in urban settings. Now, by urban settings, that doesn't mean big cities necessarily. Anywhere there's development, anywhere people live, we'll consider that an urban setting. That is developed settings rather than wildland forestry. So that's what we mean by that, lest you worry about, well, I'm not in downtown Charleston, so it doesn't apply to me. Yeah, it does. So let's move on. And we're going to be talking about pines. Oftentimes you'll hear presentations about these diseases and things, and the focus tends to be on hardwood trees, the broadleaf trees, and pines get kind of left out. But pines are a very important urban tree in South Carolina, as well as our most important commercial species of tree. You might not know that we have 10 species of pines that are native to South Carolina. We see the list of them right here. The eastern white pine is a mountain tree. Doesn't do well anywhere down from the mountains. Longleaf pine we're all familiar with, and most common in the sand hills and coastal plain. Shortleaf pine statewide, as is loblolly. Pond pine, this is a tree of the wetter areas, primarily in the coastal plain and up into the sand hills. Spruce pine, not a very common pine. This is a wetland pine. It's not a spruce tree, it's a pine tree. The bark is kind of smooth, looks a lot like a white pine. This is found in river bottoms and swamps in the coastal plain. Slash pine, native to the bottom corner of our state, Hampton, Jasper, Beaufort County, Lower Charleston County, that area. Pitch pine, another mountain tree. It is found scattered in the Piedmont. Virginia pine is a Piedmont tree with a stray population in the northern sand hills. And Table Mountain pine in our highest mountains, places like Sassafras Mountain. The picture on the far right shows the spiny cone of a spruce pine. So these are the species of pines. The diseases and disorders I'm going to talk about are common to all of them, some more than others, and I'll try to clear that up as we go. 4 of our native pines are the ones that are most often found in urban settings. That's the longleaf pine, which I live in Greenwood. We have longleaf pines growing in Greenwood that were planted as ornamentals many years ago and are doing just fine. Shortleaf pine, again found statewide. Loblolly pine, statewide. And the eastern white pine we find planted throughout the Piedmont and up into the mountains. And occasionally we'll find a stray planted down in the coastal plain. And if they're doing well, that's an exception. The others are mostly wild pine trees that rarely planted, sometimes Virginia pine is planted as a screen or something. Now, pines they get a bad rap. They're pretty good trees, pretty good urban trees. Now, all trees will provide benefits in urban settings, and there are advantages and disadvantages to all the trees. But pines do have their place. Pines, like all other trees, are great in helping to manage stormwater. They intercept rainfall. They extend the duration of rainfall. That is, they hold the water and then let it drip slowly to the ground, so you don't get it all at once. That's true of any tree with leaves on it. Um, so that slows runoff and helps the water soak into the ground. That is to infiltrate into the soil. Pine needles are valuable. You've all seen pine needles for sale. Perhaps you've bought them and put them around your shrubs. They're a great ground cover or mulch. And in the native environment, you get natural mulching from pine needles. They make a great ground cover. They're durable, and they have advantages there. And then pine trees in landscaping, they provide a lighter shade. Shrubs, especially flowering shrubs like azaleas, prosper under pine trees, and so they're great for that. Of course, like other trees, pines absorb water from the soil, and so they take this water up, use it for transpiration. They use it in photosynthesis, and the byproducts of that is more water, which they transpire out. As they breathe it out, which is a great cooler for the air. That's why tree shade is cooler than shade from man-made structures like buildings and bridges. Pines are an important part of the water cycle, so we don't need to give them a bad rap about that. Like other plants and especially trees, they do sequester carbon as they grow. They're hardy, they're adaptable, they're drought resistant. They require very little maintenance, and they enhance real estate values. A real estate setting with mature pine trees, it's a beautiful setting. They give year-round air filtering, as do evergreen broadleaf trees like hollies, magnolias, and live oaks. They may not be quite as effective at these at stormwater mitigation, but they are very effective in doing that. And they provide wildlife habitat. A lot of animals eat pine seeds, and of course, there's the shelter, nesting, and roosting sites that pine trees provide for a variety of animals. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later, especially with regard to dead and dying pine trees. And as I mentioned, pines do require less maintenance than most species. So pines are good trees, but they're not perfect. They have their drawbacks. Right now, I'm talking from my sunroom on my house. My sunroom used to be a screen porch. The reason it's now sunroom is primarily from pine pollen, because it was just unusable during the most pleasant time of the year in the springtime. Pine pollen is well, you know about it. It coats everything with yellow in the springtime. And then there are the pine cones. Okay, you can do like me and run over them with your lawnmower if you're not into turf grass, which I'm not, but pine cones, they make great fire starters, I guess, but they're a nuisance. Then there's the flammability of pine straw. I haven't seen it happen often, but I've seen fires start outside the door of a business where there was mulching with pine straw. And of course, people come and flip their cigarettes out before going indoors or come in for a smoke or something. And that can be a problem. And any burning where you've got pine straw mulch, it's a bit of a fire hazard. Foresters who do prescribed burning like to see pine straw because it carries a fire very well. And pines can contribute to air pollution. Now, they're great for filtering particulates out of the air, like all leaves are. And so they're a plus and a minus because of the terpenes they give off, helping to give the blue to the Blue Ridge Mountains, that summer haze that we see there. So they do contribute in some ways to air pollution under certain weather conditions. And then people perceive pines as having a predisposition to failure. They think they're brittle, they're always breaking in storms. Well, looking out my window at pine trees right now, and I've lived here for 32 years, and none of them have broken yet. Uh, Pines that are newly exposed to new wind patterns or something like that, pines in hurricanes, tornadoes, yeah, they're going to break. Under normal weather conditions, they're pretty tough trees. A live pine tree rarely breaks. And then there's the susceptibility to pine bark beetles, and we're going to talk about that for just a minute. You see a really old poster. I've seen this poster since I got out of college, and that was a long time ago. You see these major species of pine bark beetles, 5 of them that we have in South Carolina. There are others, but these are the major ones. There's only one of those 5 that's a real problem. And if you can see the cursor I'm moving on my screen, the one I'm circling, the second from the bottom, the southern pine beetle. This one has the potential during an outbreak to attack healthy pine trees and kill hundreds of trees at a time in a spot. We haven't had a severe outbreak of these actually in decades. The other ones, that big mean looking one in the bottom, the big one, trees usually survive an attack. If there's a healthy pine tree, it will often survive an attack of the black turpentine beetle. The picture on the right shows, we call them pitch tubes. This is pitch oozing out of the holes where the little pine beetle bored a hole in it to attack the tree. A healthy tree will do that. You'll see a lot of pitch. And sometimes that's a tree's defense mechanism. Sometimes it will actually drown the beetle that's attacking it. So the point is, a healthy pine tree can often withstand and fight off a pine beetle attack, with the exception of a southern pine beetle outbreak. But a tree that, of course, is not in good health will not have a whole lot of pitch in it, and it is much more susceptible. So this is going to be a common denominator with all the things we talk about today. It's the health of the tree. A healthy, vigorous tree can withstand just about everything we're going to talk about today. So let's talk about what causes stress in pines. Probably the number one thing in an urban setting is some change in the site, such as soil compaction, soil that has become compacted. Changes in drainage, either making the site drier or especially making the site wetter, like damming that will cause water to back up and raise the water table, or beaver dams. Any number of things can change the drainage. Grade changing, this will either be removing soil or adding soil. And if we remove soil, like we're lowering the grade, that's going to remove roots as well. And other kinds of root damage, especially from trenching and things like that, just operating equipment, because roots are pretty shallow, as we'll talk about in a moment. Then there's possible misuse of herbicides. I'm talking about things like feeding, weed and feed fertilizers, overusing that, especially when it's applied by homeowners rather than professional landscape managers. This can weaken and even kill trees, especially broadleaf trees, but also pines. Restricted root zones. Just about any tree in an urban setting is going to have restricted root zones. I mean, the roots can't grow just equally in all directions in an urban setting. You have infrastructure underground, you have pavement, you have the footprint of buildings, all these things. And so they don't have the root system that a wild tree would have in a wildland setting. Lightning, a common problem with pine trees. Of course, a lightning struck tree is immediately under stress, but pines survive it pretty well unless beetles get in the tree. And there's another problem with lightning struck trees we'll talk about shortly. But lightning struck trees, pine trees, will often survive the strike unless it attracts beetles, and sometimes it will. The Ips beetles can kill a lightning struck tree. Certainly southern pine beetles can, and an outbreak could actually begin from lightning struck trees. Other storm damage, breakage, of course, stresses the tree until the tree can replace that foliage it's lost, if it can do so. That would be a major stress. I mentioned this earlier with regard to root damage and all. Installation of buried utilities or irrigation systems. I've seen irrigation systems put in to help the turf grass actually kill mature trees. And mature trees are the ones easiest to kill actually by soil disturbance. So if you have pines, and we do any kind of trenching, cable TV, gas lines, irrigation, anything like that, we're cutting roots, no matter how shallow it is. If we're just doing 4 or 5 inches deep, we're cutting a lot of roots. And then there are the root rot pathogens, which is the major point of this whole presentation. So we're going to talk about root rot pathogens. What causes pines to fail? Well, basically, with any tree, if a load exceeds the tree's load-bearing capacity, it's going to fail. It's going to break, or it's going to uproot, or whatever. What kind of loads are we talking about? Well, wind basically is the main load that trees have to deal with. And under normal weather conditions, trees will adapt to normal winds. Abnormal winds, such as microbursts, tornadoes, hurricanes, yeah, any tree can fail in that situation. Other things that will increase load bearing in a tree would be things like ice. And when was it? 2014, maybe we had that terrible ice storm that went through the upper coastal plain from mid-Georgia, from the sandhills there, and cross the upper coastal plain up to Myrtle Beach and then up into North Carolina. And it just wreaked havoc on trees, especially tore up the live oaks, but that's not what we're talking about today. Other weather event, any kind of weather event that's outside the norm can cause failure in any tree. Changes in exposure. I'm talking about changes in wind exposure. This is where we have a problem with pines. If you're a forester listening to this, you know what happens if we thin a stand of pines heavily, and then we get a weather event, strong winds or ice or something like that. We have a lot of breakage there. That's normally in younger pines. In an urban setting, if we clear a lot adjacent to a lot with pines growing on it, all of a sudden the pines are exposed to wind forces that they haven't experienced before. It takes time for a tree to adapt to changes in its environment, especially changes in wind exposure. And so we have pine trees that will fail there because not only the top of the tree, not only the crown, but the root system as well have not adapted to that. And it takes time. And the healthier, younger, more vigorous a tree is, the more quickly it will adapt. On the other hand, mature trees, they're fragile and they often cannot adapt to changes in their environment. Increased leverage. I'm talking about basically raising the crown by over pruning from below. That is making the crown shorter. That raises the center of wind forces in the trees. There's more leverage there on the root system, and the trees are more likely to uproot or fail. Again, we see this in things like buffer strips, places adjacent to lots that have been cleared, where the change in wind exposure is taking place again. Loss of root support. This is from the site changes I mentioned earlier, as well as from pathogens. And then the loss of sound wood within the tree. These last ones are the things we're going to be focusing on today. Now, a few words about the root system. You see on the left of the screen here a graphic. Uh-oh, got somebody's picture up here. Boy. Okay, sorry about that. The one with the X mark on, this is an artist's rendition of a tree's root system. This is inaccurate. It's pretty, but it's inaccurate. Tree roots don't grow like that. On the right, you see something that's much more accurate. Tree roots are shallow because think what do the roots do? They absorb water, they absorb minerals dissolved in water in the soil. They need air to function, air to grow. They have to have air and pore space. Where's all the good rich stuff? It's up on the surface. That's where the compost is from the decomposing leaves and twigs and flower parts and all that. So the roots are going to grow where the goodies are. That's up at the surface. On the right, you see a very typical picture of windthrow anywhere in South Carolina. This was obviously in the Piedmont because it's red clay. It doesn't have to be. It happens in the coastal plain. Pay attention as you drive around through the countryside, especially in spring after thunderstorms. Look for wind-thrown trees and look at how deep the roots really are. Basically, the roots are going to be in the top foot of soil. In the Piedmont, because the clay is so compacted, there's so little pore space, it has the density of a brick, literally. In the coastal plain, you have down to the water table or down to a clay layer or a hard pan or something like that. Basically, if you're digging more than a foot deep, you've severed just about every root from there on. So tree roots are basically shallow. So it doesn't take much to ruin the root's ability to anchor the tree. Now, we're finally going to get to the rots, the decay, the organisms that hurt them. And I'm going to focus on 5 of them. One of them is what, when I graduated from school, was called Fomes anosis, the genus Fomes. But the people who classify, taxonomists who classify things weren't satisfied with the 2-syllable word, so they had to come up with one with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or 7 syllables. Heterobasidian. Hard enough to spell and even to say. And by the way, these Latin names I'm going to be pronouncing, I'm going to be using vernacular Latin, okay? Latin pronunciation, you have academic Latin, you have church Latin, you have legal Latin, you have biological Latin. Forget it. I'm going to pronounce this like most foresters would pronounce it, okay? So Heterobasidian used to be Heterobasidian anosum. Before that was Fomes anosis. Now it's Heterobasidian irregulare. Whatever. This is what foresters refer to as anosis root rot. This is a root and butt rot of pine trees, which is a pretty serious condition in forestry, not as much in urban settings. Phaeolus schweinitzii is a root and butt rot of pines. Leptographium procerum. Pronartium quercum is a stem rot. It's not really a heart rot or a root and butt rot, but I'm going to include it because it's so common. And then, oh, I love this one. It used to be Fomes pinei. Okay, they couldn't leave that alone. I'm going to give this a try. Porodidalia pinei is a heart rot of pine trees that is a little bit unique. And really, that my first request to do this webinar centered on that one. So I'm going to save the best till last here. Now, a common symptom of root loss in pine trees shows up in the foliage. The foliage begins to thin out. The crown becomes more transparent as you look up through it. The foliage gets more yellow. The needles get more stunted. This should not be confused with annual needle drop. The left photo here shows this. This happens every year. The pine trees, or other conifers too, for that matter, shed their old needles. That's normal, just like the oak trees shed their leaves. They shed the older ones and keep the newer ones. That is not a disease. The center photograph shows a fungal infection. We call this needle cast, and there are actually a number of fungi that cause this. This is not a serious problem either. The pines will normally shed these. These will be older needles, and the new growth will replace them. The only place it's a real problem is with Christmas tree growers, and they hate this because, you get scrawny looking Christmas trees. The one on the right shows a condition that's called little leaf disease. It's primarily in shortleaf pines in the Piedmont. It can also affect loblolly pines. This is a complex. The organism that's at the center of this is not truly a fungus, it's a water mold, and that's Phytophthora cinnamomi. It's a complex of Phytophthora infection, very compacted, poorly drained soil, and nitrogen deficiency, and probably some other things too. And this causes a gradual decline and death of the trees. The photo on the right shows this, but these symptoms would be more or less like the symptoms you would find with any root loss in a pine tree. So let's start with the heterobasidian, the Fomes anosis, as I learned it. It is a serious disease of planted pines. It normally shows up in younger pines after a stand of pine trees has been thinned, because it tends to infect through the freshly cut stumps, then spreading through root grafts to surrounding trees and taking them out, either killing them outright or causing wind throw because the roots are rotten. So an irregularly shaped conch grows. A conch, by the way, is the fruiting body or the mushroom-like thing. It's what produces spores. So when I use the word conch, we're talking about those, okay? So they're irregular in shape. They may or may not be present, but if they are present, they're often hidden down under the pine straw or the duff around the root collar of the tree. Again, this is a malady that usually occurs on well-drained sandy soils after some trees have been cut. It produces a white stringy root rot. It can cause extensive wood throw and a lot of economic loss, but this is not something common found in urban settings. If you are a forester and you're dealing with this, go to the website or start looking up some information about how to deal with it. There are some things that can be done. They're not cheap, but they're better than losing your trees. Now, this fungus also occurs in the Piedmont, but primarily in eastern red cedar. And eastern red cedar is a fairly common tree in urban settings, and it can occur randomly there. So let's talk about this a little bit further. Here you see it in pine trees. You see the conchs in the center picture showing up very easily. They're not usually that easy to see. An early symptom of this, if you suspect it, is pitch soaking of the roots, the live roots. As they decline, deteriorate, then as the tree dies, you'll find a white stringy root rot. The photo on the left shows how it progresses through root grafts. You see dead trees in the center of that picture, one with red needles on the left. The ones on the right apparently not affected yet. So it tends to spread progressively from a central point. How do you detect that? On the right, you see a conch there with a ballpoint pen just for scale. Again, looking for thinning foliage, reduced growth, wind throw. If you start seeing a number of wind-thrown trees and young pines, especially if pines have been cut in the area through thinning or maybe clearing an adjacent lot or something, it's progressive from tree to tree. It's not likely to be encountered in urban situations because that's just not the situation you have unless you have clearing of land for maybe a change in land use or something. You have freshly cut stumps adjacent to pines. And again, it's primarily seen in younger trees. Now, in eastern red cedar, and these photos are from Abbeville County, you see something similar, a dead tree. The left-hand picture, for instance, you see dead trees. You see one toward the center with a few needles left on it. A close-up is on the right there, the right-hand picture. The next tree is kind of an olive color, which is not a normal color for red cedar. And then you see the healthier trees as you move away from the foreground. This is the kind of progression we see with the heterobasidian, the anosis root rot. And again, infection usually occurs when a tree or trees are cut. The stump is infected and it spreads through roots and root grafts into other trees. Now, another one that's probably more serious in an urban setting, but not as common as Phaeolus schweinitzii, I'm going to pronounce it. Common name is dyer's polypore. The conch or mushroom-like structure can be used for a dye, to dye fabrics. Often called also a velvet top fungus. It's very similar to some species of Ganoderma, if you know what that is. It causes a brown rot in the roots and the base of conifers, and sometimes this extends some distance up the trunk, and it can cause a whole tree failure, a breakage at the trunk somewhere, or maybe even at the base. Often undetected until the trees break. Usually it's not so extensive that it interferes with the tree's physiological processes, but it interferes with its structural integrity and the trees can break. The mature fruiting structure is brown. It's edged with tan or yellow when it's fresh. It starts out kind of cream colored. It usually appears in the fall. You may find these conchs annually in a tree with an advanced infection, or they may be sporadic, maybe not occurring for years and then showing up occasionally. How do you tell if it's serious in your tree or not? Without the tree showing symptoms, and they often don't, one way would be invasive testing, as drilling using a tool called a resistograph, or even a cordless electric drill with a little thin 1/8 inch drill bit. Along with drilling, you can feel the rotten places. But again, that only tells you what it's like in that particular point on the tree. So it's not really handy in that. The best thing to do is look for these conchs. And here's a photo on the left of a conch and on the right of a tree that failed with this infection. A very typical conch there on the left. And here's a group of overlapping conchs here forming sort of a rosette on the right. Symptoms, again, an advanced infection, be thinning foliage, reduced vigor, the presence of conchs at the base of the tree, of course. Conchs are a definite indicator of decay. You know that there's decay there. You just don't know how much. And it fails conchs on white pine there on the left. On the right, you see a stump. This was a freshly cut stump of a hemlock that was infected by it. And you can see what the brown rot looks like. Brown rot is serious because it's not flexible. Tree can't bend with brown rot, so it's more likely to break than with a white rot, which leaves the tree able to bend and sway a bit. So the cellulose that's left is the white part, the white rot, and it is flexible. Okay, the next one I'm going to talk about is leptographium. Leptographium procera is often called procera or procerum. And actually, that should say procerum, not procera, to get my Latin correct. But it's often called procera or procerum root rot. It's a root and butt rot disease. It's most commonly found in eastern white pine. As a matter of fact, a common name of this is white pine root rot. It's fairly common when a white pine is planted off-site, which is most of South Carolina. They grow in the mountains. These trees are most common above, say, 2,500 feet elevation and on up. You get around Asheville, North Carolina, you see a lot of them in the woods because it's similar elevation. Plant them in the Piedmont, or especially in the coastal plain or sandhills. The stress trees tend to attract certain weevils. These weevils would be, the foresters know this, the Paley's weevil and the deodar weevil. These actually vector the disease. So like a anosis root rot, it can spread progressively by root grafts from tree to tree. So symptoms are kind of unique with this. You see a lot of pitch flow in the lower trunk, followed by the typical root rot foliage symptoms, the yellowing, the thinning of the crown, and eventually it turns red and dies and progressively goes through the stand or the group or often a row of trees. So this is what you end up with. You'll have scattered dead trees, but as it progresses through root grafts or being vectored by the beetles, healthy trees will start showing this pitch flow, and it gets very serious, and it's really easy to spot at this stage, and the trees will be dying progressively. So the solution to Procerum is just not to plant them off site. Just don't use this for a shade tree in urban areas. It shouldn't be on your list. This is a mountain tree, which should be used in the mountains where it's at home. The next one is not really a heart rot or a butt rot. This is a stem rot. It's called fusiform rust, Cronartium quercum, which as I was growing up was Cronartium fusiforme. And there are varieties of this fungus, but southern gall rust, I guess, or fusiform rust would be the common names of it. It produces a canker on a mature tree on the main stem, which is often referred to as a cat face. It's a really serious economic pest in forestry. The fungus infects pine through the base of a needle when it's young. On branches, it will form a spindle-shaped gall, or on a young trunk of a tree, a spindle-shaped swelling, a gall. And if it's on the trunk of a young tree, it will probably kill that tree. If a tree survives that, it will become a sunken canker rather than a swollen gall. That canker will destroy the tree's value as saw timber, but it's not going to destroy its value as a shade tree. Urban trees can live with this fungus for a long time. Here you see a gall on the branch, and this is a springtime picture, probably in April. When the spores are being formed, they're bright yellow to orange, so it's really easy to spot here. In the middle is an old canker on a main stem. Now this canker is encompassing roughly a third of the circumference of this tree. That's a threshold that some people say from that point the tree is a high risk, it should be cut down. Well, it depends. If the tree is protected from the wind, if it's in a stand of trees, it can last a long time with a canker of this size on it. You get to half the circumference of the tree, it's probably a good candidate for removal if there are targets nearby that it could fall on. If not, let it stand. If it dies, you've got habitat. More on that later. On the right, you see one that is partially failed, and you see the bright orange spores here at the main canker, and also a little bit farther up the stem as the fungus has progressed. So that, again, is a serious forest pest. It's easy to detect because it's very obvious when your tree has it. It's not necessarily something that's going to be a problem as far as spreading because this is a rust fungus. It has an alternate host. It spreads from pine trees to oak trees. It forms little hair-like structures on the bottom of an oak leaf. Those give off spores which go back and infect the base of a pine needle on a pine tree. So it's not going to spread from tree to tree. It's not going to be a problem in that respect. It's not contagious. So again, the cankers are easily seen, especially in the spring. They will catch your eye then. This does weaken the stem of a tree, and it can result in major strength loss and make the tree more likely to fail in abnormally severe weather. Under normal weather conditions, a tree with, say, a third of the circumference or a bit more infected with this is not a bad tree. You can keep these trees and enjoy the benefits of them. But again, a tree with a large stem canker, if there are targets present, should be considered a candidate for removal. And now the biggie here, red heart or red ring rot or Porodidalia pini, if you prefer to sound really smart. This is red heart. It's not really a pathogen technically because it's not killing any part of the tree. It's just a decay fungus that's rotting out the center of the tree. It's a slow-acting fungus. Infection comes from wind-borne spores from conchs on a tree. These will infect small wounds or branch stubs. Branch stubs are a primary way that this gets into a tree. So the conchs of these fungi, of this fungus, can live for a long, long time. It's a perennial conch. It will stay on the tree and produce spores for many years. So the trees that are infected with this may or may not show conchs. And here in the center, you see a photo of one of these conchs. Let me back up a little bit. There might not be any sign of stress because this is killing the center, or eating, not killing, but eating the center of the tree, which is not active wood anyway. The outer part of the tree, just under the bark, that's where all the life is. That's where the flow of nutrients down from the leaves and flow of water up from the base of the tree, all takes place right there, right under the outer bark and the phloem and xylem of the tree. Well, this doesn't affect that. It does affect the center of the tree. As long as there's enough wood in the uninfected phloem and xylem of the tree to support the tree, no problem. And the tree will remain healthy until it breaks. Even if it does fall, it's rare that you see a lot of symptoms in the foliage of the tree. And you might start seeing foliage symptoms because of other things that would go along with this, the decline of a root system of an over-mature tree. But a tree infected again with red heart might not show any signs of stress until the tree breaks. Now, on the left, we see a cross section. This is the end of a log that was infected with red heart. And you see why it's sometimes called red ring rot, because sometimes it will infect a ring around the tree without eating out the very center of the tree. On the far right, you see what can happen with a failure of this. And again, it can be a perfectly healthy tree until that happens. So healthy on one hand, unsound on the other. Detecting this, that is a problem. How do we detect it? Well, if conchs are present, conchs again are a definite indicator of decay. Old branch stubs might give you a clue. An irregularly shaped trunk. Now, the tree might have a straight trunk, but it might have wide and narrow places in it, which would be response growth to the strength loss from that internal decay. Not often, and it's usually not dramatic enough that you would really notice. You could drill the tree. It might indicate the presence of or extent of decay at a particular location, but again, just that location, because red heart can be fairly localized within a tree. Another thing to look for is horizontal bark abnormalities, which can occur in mature trees with advanced infections of red heart. And here's some right here. On the left, you see one with some abnormal swellings, and some of these are from branch stubs, but that's not a perfectly straight trunk like you would expect to see on a healthy loblolly pine. In the center and on the right, which is more or less a close-up of it, you see these bark abnormalities. It's bits of bark just sticking out like shingles or something on the side of a tree. And you can tell that the trunk of the tree is a little bit abnormal too. You see the response growth where it's not perfectly straight as well. These are loblolly pines with probably a pretty serious infection of this. Here it is in pitch pine. This is a mountain tree. I've been watching this tree for many years, and this conch has been there for many years. And you see the similar bark abnormalities and the abnormal shape of the bark. For instance, it's wider up here than it is down here. This tree looks perfectly healthy, has a healthy crown, good color in the foliage. Probably maybe 15 years ago, a tree on this same site, probably about 40 feet from this tree, was cut down. The tree had no red heart whatsoever. I counted the rings on the stump. It was 99 years. So that we're talking a 100-year-old tree here that's had red heart for many, many years. So it's not necessarily a death sentence if you do have it in the tree. Which trees are most susceptible to it? Well, look at the tree on the left. You see smooth bark. It kind of looks like bark is missing. That's sunlight and shadows on there. Smooth bark is not normal for a pine tree. Once the bark starts getting slick, good chance you might have red heart in it. A flat top, center picture. We got trees that no longer show apical dominance. They're flat on the top. Okay, those are mature trees. The longer they stay there, the more over mature they are, the more likely they are to have it. On the far right is an old lightning strike scar with a red heart conch growing out of it. Again, it doesn't just come in through branch stubs. It can come in through any wound of any size. So what do we do about it? Well, one thing, we can prune off branch stubs. If this is in an urban setting, that's not unrealistic to remove the dead branch stubs. Here's a photo from, or a diagram from the Arbor Day Foundation. This has been around for a long time, showing how to properly cut it. Removing dead branches properly is easy enough. You just want to cut off the dead part and don't wound the live stuff. If we wound the live part of it, the branch collar at the base of it, we're creating another wound where red heart or other fungi can get in it. So we're defeating the purpose. So we want to prune the dead branches back as close as possible to the live tissue without cutting into the bark of the live part. And that may remove a stub that the fungus could come into. Certainly, it will allow the tree to seal over that wound more easily than it would waiting for the stub to fall off naturally. So pruning is a tool that we can use to minimize this in our urban trees. Now, what if your tree has one of these conditions? The heterobasidian phaeolus, or all these names that I gave you. What if your tree does have a root or heart rot condition? Well, is it a problem? Is it a threat? We need to determine if there's a target within the target zone of the tree. If the whole tree, assume the worst, assume the whole tree falls, it breaks at the base or it uproots or whatever, would it strike a target? A target might be a house, a power line, parked cars, maybe where people are. People be the most important target, of course. Is it very likely that a target would be struck? If not, well, no target, no problem. So we could leave it there. But a target, by definition, is a person who could be injured, property that could be damaged, and activity that could be disrupted, such as traffic flow or uh, electricity or something like that. And again, the target zone would be equal to the height of the tree. I mean, you have an 80-foot tall tree and it falls, then if there's a target within 80 feet in the direction that it fell, then it would be struck. So if there's not a target, do we really need to remove the tree? Now you can say, well, a person could be walking under it, so we have to determine the likelihood that a target would be present. And this is a case where it might be good to have a certified arborist come and do a risk assessment. There is a tree risk assessment qualification that's available for certified arborists. And if an arborist is certified, they'll know about this. It's provided through the International Society of Arboriculture. And with a risk assessment, all sorts of things go into this assessment, such as site conditions and loads on the tree health and species, and then any defects in the tree. And all this is put together to determine the likelihood that it would fail and strike a target and cause unacceptable damage. So that's what the risk assessment would involve. And a qualified person can make that assessment for you. So find a certified arborist, find out if they have the tree risk assessment qualification. If you have a tree that you have some doubts about with regard to could this strike a target? Do I really have a risk here? And again, it's a professional opinion. It's not a 100% surety that it's low risk or high risk or what or in between. But it's a professional opinion based on observations of that arborist. But how about leaving a dead tree in place? If it doesn't threaten a target, it can actually be a benefit. Any number of animal species, lots of things, nest in cavities of dead trees. As a matter of fact, dead trees provide a lot of food. Woodpeckers, as you know, live on things that they peck out from the tree, even after it falls. I mean, bears love a dead tree on the ground. They can tear it up and eat bears and skunks and other things, tear it up and eat the grubs out of it. But a dead pine tree, foresters call them snags, it's not going to spread disease to any other tree. It's not going to harm anything unless it falls on it and hits it. But, squirrels, flying squirrels, owls, lots of things. So an option that would benefit wildlife is rather than to remove the entire tree, why not remove the top portion of the tree? In other words, shorten it so that the target zone shrinks down. And if the remainder of it falls, it's not going to strike anything and cause a problem. So leaving the shorter pole-like trunk for wildlife to use, not a bad idea. This would simulate what the wildlife would find in a forest if the tree were broken in a storm or something. And the animals will thank you for it. So trees with heart rot, even if they're not dead, including pines, they do provide valuable nesting and resting habitat for all sorts of creatures, birds, mammals, reptiles, even insects, butterflies even. Some common cavity nesting birds in South Carolina, for instance, would include this list right here, and I'm not going to read it to you. You can scan it over. Lots of them, and this is not an all-inclusive list. Cavity nesting birds need these things, and rather than build birdhouses and put them around, nature provides birdhouses through dead trees or trees with cavities in them. There's a very interesting bird that is in South Carolina. It's a native bird here called the red-cockaded woodpecker. Many foresters are very familiar with this because it impacts forest management decisions. It requires open stands of mature pine trees for nesting, roosting, and foraging, and they prefer live pine trees with red heart. Why? Well, imagine yourself a woodpecker. You'd rather peck a hole in a tree that has decay in it or a tree with good sound wood. Okay, well, they don't require red heart in a tree, but they would prefer usually loblolly or pond pines that have red heart fungus for their nesting cavities. And here is a chunk of a tree. This is a blowdown. You can't cut trees to get specimens like this. It's a violation of federal law, but this is a blowdown uh, in the Francis Berry National Forest with the red cockaded woodpecker nest in it. You see the hole there. And you see the woodpeckers, this particular species, pecks holes all around the nesting hole to make sap flow, which discourages predators like rat snakes and flying squirrels. You know, the southern flying squirrel is actually a carnivore. They will eat baby birds as well as the eggs. Well, they are an enemy of this bird. Here we see, and this is in the same location here, one that's been cut down the middle. And you see what the interior of it looks like. But the interesting part about this one is it shows you red heart. And look at it. The red heart may have entered through this branch stub on the lower part of the specimen here. May have entered there, and it has spread downward and upward. But notice that is way up in the tree where that occurred. It's not infecting the entire tree. So that's an insidious thing about red heart. It can be just about anywhere in the tree, and we don't know unless there's a conch there just exactly where it is. But again, look at all the good sound wood there around it too. So this tree was not in danger of breaking and falling. Uh, a relatively sound tree, and because of where it is, I know that there were no targets there because red cockaded woodpeckers do not nest in urban or developed areas. This is a forest bird. The main reason this is an endangered species is because of removal of mature pines. And also fire suppression. Smoky bear is not a friend of the red cockaded woodpecker. They need open woods to forage. They will not, if it's got a heavy undergrowth, a heavy understory, they will abandon the area. So prescribed burning is actually a tool for managing these things. But again, this is not something commonly encountered in urban areas. Now, these root and bud and heart rots, they're not a real common problem in urban residential settings in pine trees, more common in hardwood trees. But it's more common that problems come from abiotic factors such as soil compaction, root damage from equipment, grading and trenching especially. All these things cause stress, and they predispose pines to being infected with diseases or attracting bark beetles, which can kill them. Lightning strikes and damage from high winds or ice are other causes of stress or mortality in urban pines. But all these are abiotic, attracting the biotic problems, such as the bark beetles and the disease fungi and that kind of thing. The key to managing any species of tree in the urban forest is to minimize stress, keep it healthy and happy. Hey, just like managing people, healthy and happy, we're less likely to get disease. Preventing damage in trees, especially root damage, is crucial. Growing the right tree in the right place, like not trying to grow a white pine in Charleston, or for that matter in Columbia, that will help avoid these problems. So when trees show signs of stress, an insect attack, or imminent failure or something, who do you call? Well, a certified arborist or an urban forester can provide you some options for mitigating that situation. So where can you find these? Well, if you need an urban forester, the South Carolina Forestry Commission has some around the state. In our coastal plain, the PD area, in the Piedmont part of the state, we have urban foresters assigned to that part of the state. You can go to the Forestry Commission website, scfc.gov, and find just about any kind of forest management information. I mean, fire information for prescribed burning, forest management information, and urban and community forestry information. Also, information about grant programs for communities through the Urban Community Forestry Program. So get on your website and find that. Be careful on the internet with websites from commercial sources. Some are really good, some are really bad. University sources are usually good. Government sources usually have good information because they tend to be impartial. Careful about commercial websites. Check them out with others. Don't take the word of one. So that's just a word of wisdom regarding seeking help. But the Forestry Commission is there to help you. So do we have any questions?
Thank you, Jimmy, so much. I haven't seen any questions in the chat yet, but people, even it's thanks for the plug, and yes, we're definitely glad to help everybody with their urban and community forestry questions around the state. Well, it looks like we don't have any questions. I guess you explained it really well. We so much appreciate your time, Jimmy. And, thank you everyone for joining us. It looks like Tim Gillette might be typing something. Could be a hard question or a hearty thank you, so we'll see. Uh-oh, Mike Shealy's writing something. Okay, so he's thanking you. We'll just make sure that Mike's not asking us hard questions. If anybody could ask a hard question, it would be Mike. Okay, well, good. That settles it. If Mike Shealy doesn't have a question, we're good. So anyway, thank you, everybody. And just email me if you have any questions about your hours. Appreciate you joining us today.